But if it is at the expense of doctrine, it's not a good thing. And that's where we have to be very careful about what's going on. I want to move today into a kind of a different area. And this will be the final area on this series of Islam. It is an area that is very current. We're talking about it really in the news today as the president visits the area, and it'll be part of his visit. It is very controversial, which made me hesitate initially whether I would talk about this subject, because it is controversial. It is very political, which is another reason I hesitated. I didn't want to bring politics into this teaching anymore than I had to, but there is some overlap, particularly since Islam is more than just religion. It is also political, it's economic, it's cultural, it's everything. But it is relevant in that as we began this series looking all the way back to Abraham, reading out of the book of Genesis, and looking at what happened there, what promises God made to Abraham, looking at the two lines of lineage between down to Isaac, as the Bible refers to both Old and New Testament, the child of the blessing, versus Ishmael, which they refer to as the child of the flesh, and not the child of the promise or the blessing. And tracing those two lineages and seeing how the original difficulties between the two groups of people began all the way back there. And so the former Saudi ambassador was right in that there is a connection between all three religions back to Abraham, but that does not mean, as I think he meant, that therefore there is great commonality among the religions, because there's not. Muslims follow the lineage of Ishmael, saying that was the child of promise, and the Christians and the Jews follow the lineage of Isaac, saying that was the child of promise. And so I want to take a look at that because it's relevant to some of those promises made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob down through the lineage of Isaac, and leads to what we have today. Let's first look at the book of Zechariah, chapter 2, verses 7 through 9. 2, 7 through 9, if somebody will read that, please.
Help Zion, escape you who dwell in the daughter of Babylon. For thus says the Lord of hosts, He sent me after glory to the nations which plunder you. For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. For surely I will shake my hand against them. They shall become spoil for their servants. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. You said 11?
No, just through 9. The you that's being referred to there is Israel. If you read it in the full context of the chapter, it's Israel. And note that it refers to Israel as the apple of God's eye. No matter what you think of Israel, no matter what you think of the Jews, and there's growing anti-Semitism again in the world, in Europe particularly, it's growing, but it's growing here in the United States as well. No matter what you think about it, you cannot dismiss the fact that the Bible teaches that Israel is special to God. They're the apple of his eye, and he has a special place for them. And we better be aware of that as we move forward with trying to find this peaceful solution between Christians and Muslims. That's part of it as well. Also look at the book of Joel, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Somebody read those. Joel 3, 1 and 2.
For behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there, on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land.
God is issuing a warning. He said, I'm going to judge those who have tried to divide up my land. Now that takes special significance when we think of what is happening even on this trip of the president and what's happened with many presidents for the last 2, 3, or 4 presidents, going probably at least as far back as George Bush the first, George H.W. Bush, at least that far back, is this talk of a two-state solution in Israel, in the Palestinian situation. God says, I'm going to judge those who divide my land. That's exactly our policy. We have seen a tremendous, as far as I'm concerned, policy shift in our current president from when he was campaigning to what he is now saying today. He said when he was campaigning, one of his first acts would be to move the United States consulate from Tel Aviv, where it currently is in Israel, to Jerusalem. And keep in mind, Jerusalem has been in the hands, and I think it's been declared the capital of Israel now for 22 years. So we have no consulate there, and it's all politics regarding the Palestinian situation. He said, I will absolutely do that. He has changed his rhetoric since he has been elected president, and especially as he's been talking here in the last couple of weeks leading up to this visit that will now take place in Jerusalem. He has said he will be visiting the Western Wall, but he will not allow any Israeli officials to join him there because of the political controversy. He has said that the Wailing Wall does not belong to Israel. And that's, of course, Jerusalem was once divided. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. It has been reunited since the 1967 war. Jerusalem, Israel does claim all of Jerusalem as their capital, and of course the Palestinians said, no, we have the capital. The Wailing Wall, even though under Israeli control and in the Temple Mount, because it's within inside what the news tends to call occupied territory that Israel has supposedly taken from the Palestinians. The Temple Mount itself is under Arab control. In other words, they run it. There's a mosque up there, and Jews are only allowed very limited access up there. So it's significant when our president has now said, oh yeah, the Wailing Wall, which is as close as the Jews can get to the Temple Mount, and it's at the base of the Temple Mount. That was the original foundation of the original temple, one of the original temples. Jewish temples were there. And that's the closest they can get and actually perform religious ceremonies is the Wailing Wall. So it's important to them. It connects them back to the old temple, which is important to the Jews. They can go up on the Temple Mount, but only in small groups, only if pre-authorized, and only if they perform absolutely no religious ceremonies whatsoever. King Christ up on the Temple Mount under the current rules. And our president has said whether or not we will now put our embassy in Jerusalem is dependent upon our discussions with all interested parties. In other words, not just Israel, but Israel and the Palestinians. So, we're maybe not going to put it there. We're going to talk to the Muslims first and see how they feel about it before we do it. And I heard on TV the current Secretary of State Tillerson and the National Security Advisor Madison have both referred to what once was called Judea and Samaria and then became known as the West Bank. They referred to it as Palestine. which is what the Muslims refer to all of the land of Israel as Palestine. So we've had some significant changes, even within this administration, of how we view this problem. And yet, biblically, God says, the Jews are the apple of my eye, and woe to those who divide my land. And so we want to kind of take a look at this situation because it is part of, and we're going to go back to Genesis, look at some of the promises that God made, and just start to take a look at it and say, how does this square with what the Bible teaches about that land?
Steve, would you give me the Bible verse in Zechariah and Joel? I'm going to write it down now, I can't remember.
Zechariah, let's see, we'll move back over.
2:7-9.
Yeah, 2, 7 and 9.
79, okay.
And then Joel 3, 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you.
And I apologize, I'm not as organized as some of our teachers have handouts for you. I'm not that organized, but and have all that stuff in.
Steve,
Yeah.
back when we divided Israel and gave them that land in 41, 42, 48. So does that also count as dividing the land up? Do you think that that made God unhappy? Because we didn't divide it up with the
Well,
original boundaries, we divided it up.
Let me defer the answer to that question until we get there, because we're going to look at that.
Oh, okay.
It's a little complicated, but it is not what we've been taught about how that all happened. And yeah, we're going to get there. It's part of a much bigger picture. And I will answer that question. Let's just defer it right now. There's also a verse, I don't know whether you've got it and stuff. I sent you last time, we didn't get to it, but the Quranic verse 104. You still have it?
Yeah, I do. I have all this material.
Have all of it?
Okay. And therefore we, and in parentheses it says, Allah said to the children of Israel, dwell securely in the promised land. And when the last warning will come to pass, we will gather you together in a mingled crowd.
If you read that within the context, and I've looked up Sirach 17, which is chapter 17 of the Quran, and read it within the context, that they are clearly referring to the Jews. They talk about Moses and that type of thing. And what did they say there? In the promised land. So even the Quran recognizes the Jews have a promised land. And that brings us to somewhat the situation we're at today. The former, and to be quite frank, I'm a little mixed up. I need to look at it more. Israel has both a prime minister and a president. And I'm not sure who was who at a given time. I don't know I could tell you exactly the different functions of the two. But she was, back in the, I believe the 60s, Golda Meir, very well known. And she was either the president or the prime minister.
She was prime minister.
Was she prime minister? Okay. Do you know the difference between the two?
Well, my understanding is the president is more just a ceremonial office.
So is that
Prime
not,
minister
is that now
is
who the president or prime minister?
It's prime minister.
Okay. So president is more ceremonial, prime minister acting the one who runs the country.
Right.
Okay. All right. That
Now the president has, Rivlin, who's the president now, has spoken out on various issues of policy and things, but I think it is just based on what the prime minister has put forward.
Right. Okay. That clarifies a little bit. Well, former Prime Minister Golda Meir, I say back, what, 60s, wasn't it, Bruce?
Yes.
That she was the Prime Minister of Israel, said the Palestinian people do not exist. Now, obviously she's a Jew, she's the Prime Minister of Israel, and people would say, well, okay, what do you expect? That's what they said. But interestingly enough, so have some of the so-called Palestinians said the same thing. One man, he was on the executive committee of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is one of the main organizations for the Palestinian movement in 1987. His name is Zaire, and I'll spell it because I'm not good at the pronunciation. Z-A-H-I. Let's see, Z-A-H-I-R. And the last name, M-U-H-S-E-I-N, Racine. He basically said the same thing. There is no such thing as the Palestinian people. It's for political purposes, that there is really no one else in the Arab nations that have a legitimate claim to the land of Israel. And so the Palestinian people have basically been formulated out of whole cloth to make that claim. That they were the original occupiers of the so-called land of Palestine, and therefore they're now being occupied and they got kicked out of their land. He said, but in reality, there's no difference between the Jordanians, the Palestinians, the Syrians, and the Lebanese. It's all the same. But he said, we've done it for political reasons and to try to give the Arabs something to rally around. In other words, Arabs hate the Jews for reasons we've already described. They need some reason to hate the Jews and to try to get rally around them. And that's what the Palestinian people are. They're basically that argument, in that the world is to sympathize because they've been kicked out of their land and now the Jews are occupying it. That's the story.
When do Palestinian people become, when does it happen? 40s, 30s, 20s, or in the 1800s?
1967.
Thank you.
You mean they just became?
That's right.
Is that right?
That's
Is
right.
that late?
We'll get there. That's when the story started. And we'll get there if we look through it. No, that's fine to ask those questions. They're relevant questions. But that's why we're going through this, because we want the truth. What's the truth about the situation? The same thing was said by Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestinian organization through the 60s and 70s. He said that on what they call the day of principle, the signing of the principle, there was an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the United States that was signed on the front lawn of the White House here in America, where they came to an understanding. And on that day, on Arab TV, he kind of contradicts himself, and he also said the Palestinian movement is not really true. It's for political purposes, so we can actually gain sovereignty over land, and we're going to take all the land that we can get. More land that we get, the more we can establish sovereignty, and we'll demand more and more until the day when we get the Arabs to join us to move against Israel and eliminate them. That's what the movement is about. That's what the PLO still claim today. They refuse to acknowledge the right of Israel to exist, and yet we are asking the Israelis to negotiate with the people who say, you have no right to exist. That's what we're asking them to do. And so, because of that, we want to take a look at how did all this come about, and answer Melanie's question, and answer Wayne's question, and what is the truth about this? How did this all come about? Was there really a Palestine? Was there really a Palestinian people? Or is this simply a political move? And again, I'll report to you decide, but I'm convinced it is a political move. And that they have perpetrated in order to ultimately eliminate the Jews. Let's go back to the book of Genesis, and let's start looking at the land itself and what God said about the land. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Somebody read those, please. Genesis 12, 1 through 3.
Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Okay, a couple of important things to take out of there, and before I get there, just to address Melanie and Wayne. I promise I will get to your questions. I don't promise I'll be today. In that, as much as I think I'm going to cover, I often don't cover that much. So we will get there either today or next
Just
time.
making sure you come back next week.
Yeah,
That was my thought.
that's my
One
leader.
way of saying it.
That's my leader. I will get there eventually. Two things that's important to take out of there. God directs Abraham to a land, a physical geographical place, and he said he's going to bless Abraham, and he tells them that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you, which goes right along with the Zechariah verse that the Israeli nation, which its roots are through Abraham, is the apple of God's eye. That also ought to be something that we keep in mind as a nation as we deal with the land of Israel and the Arabs and the Palestinian situation and whose side we're on, because God says, I'll bless those who bless you, Israel, and I'll curse those who curse you. And I think we may be walking on thin ice when we start to take a position opposite of Israel and opposite of what God promised those people. Because we're going against God directly when we're doing that. Let's read further. Also in Genesis chapter 12, verses 5 through 7.
Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and all the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan.
Okay, so we now identify this land as the land of Canaan. And remember that as we talk about the Canaanites, because these are the people that the Palestinians claim they are the heirs of, that their roots are in the Canaanites. And we'll see whether or not, as we go through, that's true. Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 through 17. Genesis 13, verses 14 through 17.
And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then they shall see thy seed numbered. Arise and walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I have given it unto you.
One of the blessings that God gave Abraham was seed, in other words, children. And remember, we've already talked about that when we first began. When these promises were made to Abraham, he was something like 85 years old. His wife was about 75 years old, and they had no children. And she was beyond what, from a human standpoint, was childbearing age. So he made this promise. He also made the promise of continued blessings on them, as far as prosperity, those type of things, and a promise of land. Now you'll hear in some of the things, one of them is replacement theology, that this promise that God made to Abraham is no longer in existence. The church has replaced it. It's a spiritual promise, not a physical land promise. Well, look at what we just read. It gives directions, north, south, east, west. You can walk across it. That doesn't sound spiritual to me. That's physical. So whatever you can see, I'll give it to you. And so, at least at this point, he has given him, we know, some land. We just don't know exactly what land. But we know there's some land here. Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. 17, 1 through 8.
When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram, and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your descendants after you and their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. And also I will give to you and your descendants the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Do you want to go on?
No, that's fine right there. Again, see the blessings reiterated. This is many years later, after the original blessings, God reinstates, says, I'll give you a blessing. Seeds, I'll multiply your seed, you'll be the father of many nations, kings will come from you, you will be blessed, and I give you the land of Canaan. Again, an actual physical place, because there was a place called the land of Canaan in those days. And we'll get there and we'll look more at that. Chapter 22, verses 16 through 18. (16 through 18).
And said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants, as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.
This is taking place right after Abraham had offered Isaac as a sacrifice upon top of the mountain that God had instructed him. God caused him to withhold his hand, provided a lamb as a sacrifice. You remember that story. This is a result of that. And again, God reiterates the exact same blessing many years later. Isaac is now probably around 13, 14 years old. So we're now again another 15, 20 years down the road. He's reiterated these promises, and he said, I will allow you to possess the gates of your enemies. I don't know how much you know about ancient Jewish history and times back in those days, what the gates meant. But in these cities, because this was pretty wild land. I mean, there was no government, there was no EPA, and Americans, ACLU, and those types of things. You pretty much fended for yourself. People congregated together in walled cities. And the gates were important. That's where legal transactions took place, such as transfer of land took place there, and other things. Court took place in the gates of the city. Also, the gates is, if you could get into the gates of the city, you could take that city as an enemy. A lot of times they had elaborate traps within the gates, trying to get their enemy to come in and they kill them within the gates and stuff. They had these mazes in there and stuff. So the gates were important. So if you're saying you can possess the gates of your enemy, in other words, you've taken over their seat of government. You've entered into their walled city and it's yours. That's what he's saying. There. I'm going to give you the land. And what land is he described? The land of Canaan. Okay, now let's go turn to Deuteronomy. Chapter, I think we're reading my notes right here, 34, I believe it is. Verse 4. God talking to Moses. This is over 400 years later. 34:4. If I'm reading my notes right here.
Then the Lord said to him, This is the land in which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there.
Now, again, if you know your biblical history, you know that as they came out through the Exodus and wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, and then there was a time when he decided, okay, we're ready to go in the land. Moses was not allowed to go in because of some disobedience he had while he was wandering in the wilderness. God told him to speak to a rock to produce water. He struck the rock, and God said, as a result of that, you will not enter the land. But he took Moses up on a high hill and allowed him to look across the Jordan River into the land. And so 400 years later, he's pointing out a physical land. I'll allow you to see this land that I promised you. That was the land of Canaan. That's where Abraham originally came from. And then when we get down to his grandson Jacob, they ended up down in Egypt because of the drought. And then they were there as invited guests. That's the whole story of Joseph. And then after a while they became slaves. And that's where they were at the time of Moses in the Exodus. They were slaves of Egypt. And Moses then worked to let them out. So we're 40 years after that, after wandering in the wilderness, when again this promise is reinstated probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 440 to 450 years after Abraham. So it is very clear that there was a land promised to the Jews. It would be their land forever, is what was promised. And as we pointed out, even the Quran acknowledged there was a promised land. They don't dispute that. And so the question is, what was the extent of that? And if you would, it's complicated, but if you would look through Genesis and look at what was said, what you would basically find out is that the land that God promised to Abraham ran from the Red River along the southern border, clear over south of Gaza, which is southern, down south of what current Israel, up the west coast along the Mediterranean, all the way up into Lebanon, including most of Lebanon, then east over to the Euphrates River, and then back down the east bank of the Jordan River all the way back down to the Dead Sea. That's what was promised. That would include all of current Israel, all of what is referred to as the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and most of the nation of Lebanon. That's what God promised to Abraham. That was the land of the Canaanites, was that land. And the closest Israel had ever come to possessing that land is during the time of Solomon, when they came close, but not entirely, did they possess that land. So that promise had yet to be fulfilled. God promised it. He didn't actually say when. Abraham never saw it. Isaac never saw it. Jacob never saw it. David never saw it. But Solomon came close to seeing it. And now look where we're at today. The land of Israel isn't even close to that. And that's starting now to get to the question, and we're going to get into more history of it, but both of what Melanie has asked and what Wayne has asked, what was the land and when did it get divided? Well, we're going to get there.
Is there a mineral or something there that the other countries want, or is it just out of hate?
I think it was sheer hate. The Arabs control 99% of the Middle East, the land. Israel constitutes 1% of the land mass.
Just a little slice
You
of
could
land.
take the nation of Israel, I just heard this the other day, and put it in Lake Michigan, which is what Chicago is on the shores of Lake Michigan, I believe. It is not the biggest of the Great Lakes, and Israel completely disappeared. In other words, it wouldn't even touch the banks of Lake Michigan. It would disappear inside the Lake Michigan. It's about the size of the state of New Jersey. And with the Arabs controlling 99%, they say, no, that's not good enough. We want 100%. There's no room for the Jews here. How do you explain that other than sheer hate? Where does that go back to? All the way back to Isaac and Ishmael. Go back to. And so that's kind of what we're facing, in that that's what was promised. God said it was forever, and it hasn't yet been done. And we're talking about dividing up the land of Israel even more, and giving even more to, as we'll see, not the Arab people, because the Palestinians, their roots really aren't Arab. Well, in some ways they are, but not the people they claim they're from. They're not Arabic at all.
And we don't even really know it
we will
all.
not get to your question today. What?
And if we don't, ourselves, we don't understand it all. Just look at all the governments that wouldn't understand it.
We'll talk about, we're running out of time, but we'll talk about this next week. We'll hopefully get to the two questions that were asked next week. But the Palestinians claim that their possession goes all the way back to the land of Canaan, and they claim their rights are the Canaanites and the Philistines. That's their ancestors. Trouble is, most of the current day Palestinians are Arab. None of the Canaanites were Arab at all. And there's two basic divisions of the Canaanites, and the Philistines are Arab either. There isn't any Philistines anymore. There isn't any Canaanites anymore. It hasn't been for centuries. We'll talk about that more next week. But there's two types of Canaanites, the northern Canaanites and the southern Canaanites. And like I said, the land of Canaanite ran all the way up into Lebanon, and all the way down into the Gaza Strip, and all the way to the east side of the Jordan River. All that land that we are now told the Jews are occupiers of. They have stolen. That's the land God originally gave them. And even the United Nations acknowledged that, and we'll look at that next week, in their original charter, and when they set up Israel. And now we'll be getting the question that Mommy asked, when did the land start to get divided? We're going to look at that, because even the UN Charter in Article 80 acknowledged that land was Israel when it was originally set up. And that got changed somewhere along the way. And that's what we're going to talk about. All right, we'll have to stop there. We'll look more at the history of the Canaanites and kind of trace through the history of the land of Israel from ancient days all the way to what's going on even up to today. Any questions or comments about what we looked at so far?
How did Americans get so involved in all this?
Right. Because we're Christian and we're supposed to be obeying God and not
I
man.
think that's probably the best answer. We immediately joined, just minutes after Israel was declared a nation in 1948, we went on international radio and acknowledged their existence. So we go back, and I think it does go back to our common roots with Christianity and Judaism. And it goes back even further than that. I mean, Israel really started to come together in the 1890s. And then there's a lot of sympathy for them after the World War II and the Holocaust. That's somewhat how it all came about in 1948.
Well, if everything is the plan of God, us, our involvement then and now both is, to me,